This is going to help the simplified memory system, or the sensory register and the short-term memory, to transfer the information about key signatures into the long-term memory. This way he won't have a failure to store or retrieve. That's my hope for the mnemonic devices. This will also help so that he won't have a reconstruction error. Using a mnemonic device gives each of the letters in the key signature a purpose, and so that it's not all jumbled in his head, he has something that helps him to remember the order. We will also be using, this is a circle of fifths charts. This one is already filled out, and I'm going to have him learn how to fill it out by himself, and then I'll also give him one like this that's already filled out that he can keep with him. This way his memory doesn't decay or eventually become extinct. The next thing we will talk about is intervals, and what the different intervals are. There are two different parts to an interval that we'll be talking about, the quality and the distance. So the quality is in a major and minor interval. There are other types of intervals, but we're just going to focus on major and minor. And the distance, is it a second away, a third away? So like this space between it, if you're looking at a piano, the distance between two normal white keys is a second, a major second. So that's the quality, the major, and then the interval or the distance is the second. A common interference is calling notes by the wrong name, because Bryce sings on the bass clef, because he's a guy. He might say the wrong notes sometimes when I use treble clef, and I'll be mixing it up. I'll use, like, here's an example. Here's an example of a worksheet I'll probably use, and this was actually for the key signatures, and this is using treble clef and bass clef. So sometimes he might get that interference and mess up. It's not because he doesn't know what it is. It's just because it's interfering with his brain. I'm going to be using solfege, which is something I know that he already knows from choir, to transfer knowledge he already knows from choir to what he's learning now. So for example, when we're learning by intervals, I'll use like do, re. So do, re, which is a major second, and I'll tell him what the different intervals are so that it can kind of click with his brain. That way he already has kind of a schema for it. It's in a place where the information can be stored. We're also going to use descriptive research by playing the different intervals to understand what they sound like. So we'll use solfege so that he can get that in his brain, and then we'll also play it. And when we're playing it, we can use solfege, but the main purpose of playing it is to understand what the different intervals sound like, so that he can hear it instead of like singing it is different than hearing it. We're also going to use correlational research to figure out what tunes the intervals go to. For example, one of the most common intervals is perfect fifth. And so it's like dun dun, or the Star Wars thing, the dun 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 dun. So that's a very common one. Or a perfect fourth, which is like here comes the bride. So the here comes is a perfect fourth. Bryce will use his own ways to remember what each of these intervals sounds like. I'll give him some examples, but I want him to see if he can come up with some of his own. That's not going to be the main focus of our lesson, though. So so we won't spend too much time on that. We're going to then talk about scale degrees. Scale degrees also goes along with what he learned in solfege. It goes along with solfege, so like do would be a 1, and then re would be 2, and so on and so forth. Another thing that we'll learn about is the whole step, half step relationship between these scale degrees in a major key. We'll focus on a major key. So a major key, it's whole, half, whole, half. So we'll use a few different ways for him to remember that by playing it out on the piano in different key signatures. We'll use solfege, and then we'll talk about the difference between major and minor, and this will be focusing on intervals. So one of the things I'll use is I have another worksheet, and this is the major and perfect intervals, and then we have minor intervals, and we won't use the rest of this. I'll tear this off because we won't go into diminished or augmented or any of that crazy stuff that'll blow his mind. So we'll use experimental research when learning about this. I'll have him play a major chord and then just lower the middle note down, or the third down by a half step to make it minor. That's how I'll explain a minor chord, not a minor chord, sorry, we're talking about intervals. We'll do this with intervals, sorry. I'll just have him lower it down. We'll also use experimental research later with chords, but first with intervals. He will be using the psychomotor domain, and the motor cortex, and the frontal lobe to actually play the piano. Those are all the different things in charge of your physically actually doing something.